You ever meet someone whose entire sense of self-worth is wrapped up in a clipboard and a sensible beige shoe? People who think a slightly overgrown lawn is a moral failing. Well, I moved into a rusted-out cabin to get away from the world, and within 3 hours, a homeowners association stormed my porch. They demanded my land. They threatened to take everything I had left. What they didn't know: I own the dirt under their $500,000 houses. Stick around. Cardboard boxes have a specific smell when they've been sitting in a storage unit for 5 years. Dust mostly, mixed with the faint, acidic tang of cheap adhesive breaking down. I dropped the third box of my grandfather's things onto the scarred pine floorboards of the cabin, the heavy thud echoing off the exposed log walls. I was exhausted. My hands were blistered from wrestling a rented box truck up a gravel driveway that hadn't seen fresh stone since the late 90s. But standing in the center of the main room, inhaling the lingering ghost of Harrison's cherrywood pipe tobacco, I finally felt something click into place. Peace. A quiet, heavy peace. Outside the single-pane windows, 80 acres of ancient timber whispered in the late afternoon wind. This was my inheritance. Not a fortune in stocks, not a thriving business, just a crumbling cabin with a sagging front porch, a wood stove that smoked if the wind blew the wrong way, and a deed that predated every paved road in the county. Harrison had bought the land back when the valley was nothing but deer trails and silence. Of course, the silence hadn't lasted. Through the thick barrier of pines on the eastern edge of the property, I could just make out the gleaming white vinyl fences of Oakmont Estates. It was a sprawling monument to suburban excess, rows of identical slate-roofed McMansions sitting on perfectly manicured lawns, glaring down at my overgrown patch of woods. I didn't care about them. I just wanted to be left alone to fix the roof and mourn the only father figure I'd ever known. I walked out onto the porch, wiping sweat from my forehead with the back of a filthy work glove. My truck, a beat-up Ford F-150, missing half its original paint, was parked directly on the crabgrass. It wasn't pretty, but it ran. That's when I heard the crunch of tires. A pristine silver Lexus SUV rolled up my driveway, navigating the ruts with an agonizing, paranoid slowness. It finally parked, boxing in my Ford. 2 people emerged. The woman was in her late 50s, wearing a tennis skirt and a visor, despite the nearest court being 20 miles away. Her hair was sprayed into a rigid, motionless blonde helmet. She held a thick, white 3-ring binder pressed against her chest like a shield. Behind her scurried a man who looked like he'd been genetically engineered to wear khaki slacks. He was sweating profusely, holding a digital camera. They didn't knock. They didn't even use the front walk. They marched straight across the grass, stopping 3 feet from the bottom step of my porch. "Excuse me," the woman said. Her voice was pitched at that specific frequency designed to cut through a crowded room and demand immediate service. I leaned against one of the cedar support posts. "Can I help you?" "I am Margaret," she announced, waiting a beat, as if the name alone should carry constitutional weight. "President of the Oakmont Estates Homeowners Association. This is Richard, our compliance officer. You need to stop whatever it is you are doing immediately." I looked at the cardboard box in my hands, then back at her. "I'm moving in." Margaret's eyes darted around the property, landing on the rusted gutters, the peeling window frames, and finally, my truck. Her top lip curled into a visible sneer. "No, you absolutely are not. This structure was slated for demolition. We have been very clear with the estate that this blight is a massive violation of the Oakmont community guidelines." "Estate?" I asked gently. "The previous owner passed away, a tragic thing, but frankly, a relief for property values." She didn't even blink when she said it, just absolute weaponized apathy. "We gave his lawyers 90 days to clear the lot. It has been 92. We are now seizing the parcel to convert it into common areas. See, Richard, take a picture of that hideous vehicle." Richard dutifully raised the digital camera. A flash went off in the broad daylight. A cold knot tightened in my chest. They were talking about Harrison. They were standing on the dirt he bled for, dismissing his death as a bump in their neighborhood equity. The sheer audacity of it left me momentarily speechless. I felt the familiar, dangerous urge to snap, to step off the porch and show Richard exactly where he could store that camera, but I breathed through it. Harrison had always taught me to let fools talk. They always handed you the rope eventually. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," I said, keeping my voice terrifyingly calm. "I own this cabin. I inherited it. I'm not tearing it down." Margaret sighed, the heavy, exaggerated sigh of a kindergarten teacher dealing with a slow child. She opened her binder. "Sir, I don't care what you think you inherited. This property is bound by the Oakmont covenants. Look at this." She jabbed a manicured fingernail at a laminated map. "You are clearly within the boundary lines. You are currently in violation of Section 4 regarding exterior paint, Section 9 regarding unapproved vehicles, and Section 12 regarding grass height. You owe the association $14,000 in compounded fines, and we have filed a lien." "A loan," I repeated flatly, "which we will foreclose on if you aren't off this property by Friday." She snapped, snapping the binder shut. "This neighborhood has standards. We do not tolerate squatters. We do not tolerate trash, and we do not tolerate you. Move the truck, pack your things, or I will have the sheriff drag you out." She turned on her heel and marched back to her Lexus. Richard scurried behind her, snapping one last photo of a pile of chopped firewood by the steps. They peeled out of the driveway, kicking a spray of gravel against the side of my truck. I stood on the porch in the silence that followed. I looked down at my dirty hands. Then I looked toward the white vinyl fences of Oakmont Estates. They wanted a war over grass and paint. They thought they held all the cards. I let out a low, dry laugh that startled a crow out of the nearby oak tree. I turned and walked back inside, heading straight for the floorboard safe, hidden under the rug in Harrison's bedroom. Margaret had a white binder. She thought it was a weapon. She had no idea what was buried in this cabin. The next morning started early. The sun hadn't even cleared the tree line, leaving the woods soaked in a deep, damp gray. I was sitting on a stump near the woodpile, nursing a mug of black coffee, just listening to the absolute quiet. I needed the quiet. My mind had been racing since Margaret's visit, piecing together the legal landmines left in the old floorboard safe. Then the quiet shattered. It started as a low mechanical rumble, the heavy crunch of massive tires chewing up my driveway. I stood up, setting my mug on the stump, a massive, flatbed tow truck with a yellow strobe light flashing on its roof backed down the narrow dirt path. Following right behind it was a white pickup truck bearing the magnetic logo of a local landscaping company. I walked out to the edge of the grass just as a man hopped out of the tow truck. He was a big guy, wearing a grease-stained hoodie, holding a clipboard. From the white pickup emerged Chad. I knew his type instantly. Chad was built like a retired high school linebacker who aggressively drank protein shakes and lived to correct people's form at the gym. He wore a tight polo shirt tucked into tactical cargo pants. He was a man desperately searching for an authority he had never earned. "Morning!" Chad yelled over the roar of the diesel engines. A smug grin plastered across his face. "Told you we don't mess around in Oakmont. Hook it up, Jimmy." The tow truck driver started unspooling a thick steel cable, dragging it toward the rear axle of my Ford. "Hold on a second," I said, stepping between the driver and my truck. I kept my hands in my pockets, projecting a calm I didn't entirely feel. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" Chad puffed out his chest, stepping into my personal space. He smelled strongly of cheap cologne and aggression. "Enforcing the covenants, buddy. You were warned. Unauthorized, unregistered junk vehicles are subject to immediate removal at the owner's expense. Margaret sent me to make sure it gets done." He turned to the landscaping crew, who were pulling weed whackers and a chainsaw from their truck. "You guys, start on those weeds and take down that dead oak by the porch. It's an eyesore." The oak tree, Harrison's favorite tree. He used to sit under it and carve little wooden birds for me when I was a kid. My vision narrowed. The cynical amusement from yesterday vanished, replaced by a cold, hard focus. I looked at the tow truck driver. "Jimmy, is it?" Jimmy paused, the heavy hook dangling from his gloved hand. He looked between me and Chad, clearly uncomfortable. He was just a working guy trying to earn a paycheck. He didn't sign up for a property war. Jimmy, if you attach that hook to my axle, it's grand theft auto. You are on private property. I pointed a thumb at Chad. Does not own this land, nor does he have any legal right to order a tow. He's full of it, Chad barked, his face flushing red. This is HOA property. Hook the damn truck, Jimmy, or I'm calling your boss and canceling our contract. I pulled a folded piece of paper from my back pocket. It wasn't the full ground lease. That was locked safely inside. But it was a certified copy of the county plat map and the active deed. I handed it to Jimmy. Look at the name, I said quietly. Then look at my ID. I pulled out my wallet and held up my driver's license. If you tow this, I will call the sheriff, and I will press charges, not against the HOA, against you. Jimmy squinted at the paper, then at my license. He dropped the hook. Yeah, nah, I ain't getting in the middle of this. He hit the button on his winch, reeling the cable back in. What are you doing? Chad screamed, his voice cracking slightly. I am authorizing this. I am a board member. You're a guy in tactical pants on my grass, I corrected him. Jimmy climbed into the cab of his truck. The landscapers, seeing the tow truck abandon ship, quietly slid their chainsaws back into the bed of their pickup and drove off without a word. Chad was left standing alone in the driveway, practically vibrating with rage. He pointed a trembling finger at my chest. You just made the biggest mistake of your life. We are going to bury you in legal fees. We are going to fine you until you have to sell this shack just to afford a lawyer. You are done. Chad, I said, cutting off his tirade. Do you know what a ground lease is? He blinked, thrown off by the question. What? A ground lease? It's a real estate agreement where a tenant is permitted to develop a piece of property, but they don't actually own the land itself. The land stays with the original owner. I know what it is, he snapped, clearly lying. What does that have to do with you breaking our rules? I took a slow step forward. Chad involuntarily took a half step back. Oakmont Estates was built in 1978. A developer came in and wanted to build a subdivision, but the landowner refused to sell. Instead, the owner leased the 60 acres to the developer for 99 years. The developer built the roads, the sewers, and the houses, and sold those houses to people like you. But the dirt remained the property of the landowner. Chad's eyes darted around, looking for an exit from this conversation. So what? Who cares about some ancient paperwork? I care, Chad, because my grandfather was Harrison, the man who owned all 80 acres of this mountain. The man you and Margaret harassed for the last 5 years of his life, and when he died, that deed transferred to me. I watched the words slowly penetrate the thick wall of his suburban entitlement. His jaw slacked. You don't own this cabin, I said, my voice dropping to a near whisper. Your HOA doesn't own the woods. In fact, your HOA doesn't even own the land your clubhouse sits on. You lease it from my family trust, and according to Section 4, Paragraph B of that lease, the landowner retains the right to reassess the base rent every 10 years based on fair market value. I smiled. It was not a friendly smile. The 10-year mark is next month. Tell Margaret I said hello. Chad stood frozen for 3 long seconds. Then, without a word, he turned, scrambled into his truck, and sped away, nearly taking out my mailbox in his panic. I picked up my coffee mug from the stump. It was cold. I drank it anyway. The war hadn't just started. I had just handed them the terms of their own surrender. Rain hammered against the tin roof for 3 straight days after Chad's hasty retreat. It was the kind of relentless, driving storm that turned the driveway into a soup of red clay and washed dead branches out of the oak canopy. I spent those days buried in Harrison's paperwork. His filing system was a chaotic mix of rusted metal cabinets and old shoeboxes stacked in the corner of his bedroom. Sorting through it felt like excavating a life. I found old hunting licenses from the 70s. Faded photographs of my mother standing on the porch before she moved away, and bundles of letters tied with rotting twine. But at the bottom of a heavy, fireproof lockbox, I found the Oakmont file. It was thick, and as I read through it by the light of a single kerosene lamp, the power had flickered out twice Tuesday morning. The cynical amusement I'd felt earlier curdled into something cold and sharp. Harrison hadn't just been annoyed by the HOA. He had been systematically terrorized by them. Margaret and her board hadn't started their campaign recently. It went back nearly a decade. I found carbon copies of letters Harrison had typed out on his old Smith Corona, begging them to stop sending landscaping crews to cut down his saplings. I found a stack of fines totaling thousands of dollars for utterly fabricated offenses. Failure to maintain aesthetic conformity. Unauthorized agricultural activity because he planted a tomato garden. Visual pollution for the firewood stacked on his own porch. They had weaponized their bylaws to bleed an old man dry, hoping he would simply give up, sell the underlying lease to their corporate masters, and move into a home. They knew he didn't have the energy to fight them in court. He was 82, fighting congestive heart failure, and just wanted to watch the birds in peace. They saw his kindness, his desire for quiet, as an invitation to strike. My knuckles turned white as I gripped a final letter, dated just 3 months before his death. Margaret had threatened to place a lien on the cabin, citing a fabricated boundary dispute. Harrison's handwritten note on the margins simply read, "I am so tired. Maybe it's time to let it go." He died thinking he had lost his home. By Thursday morning, the rain finally broke, leaving behind a thick, humid fog that clung to the pine needles. I walked out to the mailbox at the end of the dirt road. Inside sat a thick manila envelope, sent via certified mail, requiring my signature from a bewildered postal worker. The return address belonged to a high-end corporate law firm downtown. I tore it open as I walked back to the cabin. It was a formal cease and desist, paired with a notice of imminent foreclosure. Margaret hadn't believed Chad, or, more likely, she thought Chad was too stupid to understand whatever lie the squatter had fed him. The letter was a masterpiece of legal intimidation, filled with dense jargon demanding I vacate the premises within 48 hours or face a sheriff's eviction. They were doubling down. Perfect. I threw the letter onto the passenger seat of my Ford, turned the key, and listened to the engine cough to life. I didn't drive toward the Oakmont clubhouse. I took the state route into town, pulling up to a faded brick building wedged between a diner and a hardware store. The gold lettering on the glass door was peeling. Arthur Pendleton, attorney at law. Arthur was a relic. He wore suspenders, smelled vaguely of peppermint and stale coffee, and had represented Harrison since the late 80s. When I walked into his office, he was buried behind a desk constructed entirely of stacked case files. He looked up, adjusting a pair of wire-rimmed glasses. "I was wondering when you'd show up," he grumbled, his voice like gravel in a cement mixer. "I saw the obituary. I'm sorry, kid. Your grandfather was a stubborn old mule, but he was a good man." I dropped the thick Oakmont file and the fresh eviction notice onto the only clear patch of his desk. "They're trying to take the cabin, Arthur. They sent this today." Arthur picked up the foreclosure notice, his eyes scanning the aggressive legalese. A slow, dark chuckle rumbled in his chest. Fools. Utter arrogant fools. They actually hired Miller and Associates to draft this. Must have cost them $1,000 just for the letterhead. He tossed it aside like a piece of trash. They clearly haven't looked at the county registry in 40 years. "I need to know exactly how much power I have here," I said, leaning forward, resting my hands on his desk. I read the ground lease, Section 4, Paragraph B. Arthur's eyes twinkled with sudden, predatory life. "Ah, you found the nuclear option." He pushed his chair back and walked over to a metal filing cabinet, yanking open the bottom drawer. When Harrison signed that lease in 1978, he didn't care about money. He just wanted enough to pay his property taxes and buy his tobacco. So he leased the 60 acres to the developer for a flat rate of $12,000 a year. I did the math in my head. That's $100 a month per house, in a neighborhood where homes are selling for $700,000. "Exactly," Arthur said, pulling out a thick, yellow document bound in blue cardstock. Harrison practically subsidized their luxury lifestyles. He could have adjusted the rent in 1996. He could have adjusted it in 2006. He never did. He didn't want the fuss. But the lease explicitly states that every 10 years, the landowner, which is now you via the trust, has the unilateral right to reassess the base rent to reflect current fair market value of the underlying dirt. And the next 10-year window opens next Tuesday, Arthur grinned, slapping the document on the desk. I took the liberty of having a commercial appraiser run some preliminary numbers yesterday, just in case you decided to drop by. The land under Oakmont Estates is prime, developed residential real estate. Fair market rent isn't $12,000 a year anymore. It's roughly $1.4 million a year. My breath caught in my throat. I stared at Arthur. If divided evenly among the 120 lots, Arthur continued, his voice calm, methodical, that raises their monthly HOA land lease fee from $10 to nearly $1,000 a month per house, payable directly to you. A heavy silence filled the dusty office. I thought about Margaret's pristine tennis skirt. I thought about the sneer on her face when she called Harrison's death a relief for property values. I thought about the 80-year-old man who died feeling defeated by a woman who was living on his charity. "Arthur," I said quietly, a cold fire spreading through my chest. "Draft the reassessment notice. I want it ironclad. No loopholes." Arthur picked up a silver pen, rolling it between his fingers. "It will be. But you understand what happens when you drop this on them? They will lose their minds. People will have to sell. The board will be crucified by their own neighbors." "I know." I turned toward the door. "When is their next board meeting?" "Tomorrow night, 7 p.m. at their clubhouse." Arthur smiled. "Want me to come with you?" "No," I said, opening the door to the street, "but I think Margaret and I need to have a little chat about community standards. Fluorescent lights always make people look slightly dead. It's a harsh, unforgiving glow that strips the warmth out of a room, which made it the perfect lighting for the Oakmont Estates Community Center. I parked my rusted Ford right up front, taking up 2 spots designated for board members only. I didn't bother changing out of my work boots or the faded flannel shirt I'd been wearing all day while repairing the cabin screen door. I wanted them to see exactly who they were dealing with. I pushed through the double-glass doors at 7:15 p.m. The room smelled of floor wax and stale grocery store cookies. About 50 folding chairs were arranged in neat rows, mostly filled with older residents who looked like they treated these meetings as a competitive sport. At the front of the room, sitting behind a folding table draped in a cheap blue tablecloth, was the HOA board. Margaret sat dead center and her blonde hair sprayed into that familiar rigid helmet. Chad sat to her right, aggressively chewing a piece of gum, while Richard, the compliance officer, sat to her left, meticulously organizing a stack of index cards. Margaret was mid-sentence, lecturing a terrified-looking woman in the second row. "It doesn't matter if your son was visiting for the weekend, Helen. The bylaws clearly state that commercial vehicles, including plumbing vans, cannot be parked on the street overnight. The $300 fine stands." I walked down the center aisle. My heavy boots echoed like gunshots on the linoleum floor. The murmurs started immediately. Heads turned. Disapproval washed over me in a visible wave. Chad saw me first, his jaw freezing mid-chew. His eyes widened and he leaned over, whispering frantically into Margaret's ear. Margaret stopped talking. Her eyes locked onto me, her face tightening into a mask of pure, unadulterated outrage. She grabbed her plastic gavel and slammed it against the table. "Excuse me." Her voice echoed through a cheap PA system, shrill and commanding. "You are trespassing. This is a closed meeting for Oakmont residents only. Get out before I call the police." I reached the front row and stopped, crossing my arms. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. "I am a resident, Margaret. We met on my porch. Remember? You told me I had until Friday to pack." The crowd buzzed. A man in a golf shirt near the back muttered, "Is that the squatter? The one in the old shack?" Margaret stood up, her face flushing a deep, dangerous red. She pointed a trembling finger at the exit. "You have no right to be in this building. That property belongs to the association now. Our lawyers sent you the notice. If you are not off that land by tomorrow morning, the sheriff will physically remove you." She looked at Chad. "Call dispatch, right now. Tell them we have a hostile trespasser." Chad didn't move. He just stared at the table, a bead of sweat tracing its way down his temple. "Margaret," he hissed, barely audible over the microphone. "Don't. Call them, Chad," she shrieked, losing her carefully crafted country club composure. I reached into my back pocket and pulled out a manila folder. I tossed it onto the blue tablecloth. It slid perfectly, stopping right under Margaret's microphone. "I wouldn't bother with dispatch," I said, keeping my voice steady, projecting it so the entire room could hear. "Oh, because if the police show up, I'll have to ask them to remove all of you from my property, including this clubhouse." A stunned silence dropped over the room. You could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights. Margaret scoffed, a loud, ugly sound. "Your property. You are delusional. Richard, get this trash off my table." Richard nervously reached for the folder, but I slammed my hand down on it first. I locked eyes with Margaret. "Open it," I commanded. It wasn't a request. The sheer weight of my tone made her flinch. Reluctantly, as if the paper were soaked in poison, she flicked the folder open. Her eyes scanned the first page. It was a copy of the original 1978 ground lease, with the active deed pinned to the front, clearly showing my name as the sole beneficiary of the Harrison Family Trust. "I don't care about a fake deed," she spat, though her voice wavered slightly. "Oakmont owns that land. We bought it from the developer." "You bought the houses, Margaret. You leased the dirt," I corrected, stepping closer to the table. "My grandfather owned all 60 acres of this subdivision. He leased it to the developer for 99 years. When he died, the trust passed to me. You don't own my cabin. You don't own the woods. You don't even own the asphalt under your Lexus." I turned to face the crowd of residents. They were staring at me in horrified fascination. "For the last 5 years," I said, my voice thick with a quiet, burning anger, "this board harassed an 80-year-old man. You fined him for dead leaves. You threatened to take his home because you didn't like the way his truck looked. He let you live on his land for $12,000 a year, total. He subsidized this entire neighborhood because he was too kind to raise the rent." I turned back to Margaret. All the color had drained from her face. She was staring at the second document in the folder, the reassessment notice Arthur had drafted. "I am not my grandfather," I whispered, leaning over the table so only the board could hear the full venom in my voice. "Look at the second page, Margaret." Her hands were shaking. She lifted the heavy, watermarked paper. "Per Section 4, Paragraph B of your ground lease," I announced, raising my voice again for the audience. "The landowner has the right to reassess the base rent to fair market value every 10 years. That window opens next week. The commercial appraisal is attached. Your new annual land lease is $1.4 million. Someone in the third row actually gasped. A woman dropped her purse. The room erupted into chaotic, panicked shouting. "That means," I continued, speaking directly into the microphone on the table, cutting through the noise, "starting next month, HOA dues are going up by roughly $1,000 a month per household, payable to me." "You can't do this," Margaret screamed, slamming her hands on the table. The microphone shrieked with feedback. "This is extortion. We will sue you. We will tie you up in court for decades." "Read the lease, Margaret," I said, stepping back from the table. "It's ironclad. You signed an agreement to abide by the covenants. Isn't that what you told me? We have standards here." I looked at Chad, who looked like he was about to vomit. I looked at Richard, who was frantically reading over Margaret's shoulder, his eyes wide with sheer terror. Then I looked back at the crowd. "If you have a problem with your new dues, I suggest you take it up with your president. She's the one who insisted on enforcing the paperwork." I turned my back on them and walked down the center aisle. The residents parted from me like I was radioactive. Nobody said a word. Behind me, Margaret collapsed into her folding chair, the white binder she loved so much falling to the floor with a pathetic, hollow thud. I pushed through the glass doors, stepped out into the cool night air, and took a deep breath. Harrison's truck fired up on the first turn of the key as I drove back toward the cabin, leaving the brightly lit clubhouse in my rearview mirror. I smiled. I couldn't wait to fix the roof. Sawdust coated my forearms, sticking to the sweat that had been gathering since sunrise. I was rebuilding the front steps, tearing out the rotten wood that had nearly given way under Margaret's sensible shoes the week before. Every pull of the pry bar felt like a small victory. Every rusted nail that shrieked out of the old timber was a testament to the fact that I was still here. My phone buzzed against my leg, vibrating through the thick canvas of my work pants. I wiped my hands on a dirty rag and pulled it out. It was Arthur. "They're bleeding." His gravelly voice came through the speaker before I even said hello. I leaned against the porch rail, looking out at the tree line. "Good morning to you too, Arthur." Who's bleeding? Miller and Associates, Margaret's fancy corporate firm. They've had 3 different junior partners call my office since yesterday morning. They are desperately searching for a loophole, trying to argue that the lease is unconscionable, trying to claim adverse possession, trying to say the trust was improperly executed. Arthur let out a dry, hacking laugh. It's a massacre. I told them to read the paperwork again and hung up. Are they going to sue? I asked, watching a hawk circle high above the pines. They can't afford to. To file an injunction against the rent reassessment, they'd need to put the disputed amount in escrow. That's over $1 million. The Oakmont HOA reserve fund has maybe 80 grand in it. Margaret blew the rest on those ridiculous marble entrance fountains last year. The board is completely paralyzed. What about the residents? Panic, Arthur stated bluntly. Absolute, unadulterated panic. 4 houses went up for sale yesterday, but no title company in the state is going to underwrite a mortgage on a property with a pending $1 million land lease dispute. They are trapped. You dropped a bomb on their little country club, kid. We hung up, and I went back to the stairs, but the rhythm of the work was gone. I drove a nail into a fresh pine board, the heavy thwack of the hammer echoing through the woods. Harrison had loved these woods. He hadn't wanted to trap anyone. He just wanted to be left in peace. The people in those houses, the ones who weren't Margaret or Chad, were just families. People who bought into a neighborhood because it had good schools and a nice pool. They didn't know they were financing a vendetta against an old man. They just paid their dues and looked the other way. That was the problem, though. They looked the other way. Apathy is a luxury that always comes with a bill. Around noon, a car turned down my driveway. It wasn't a silver Lexus or a heavy-duty tow truck. It was a beige Honda Accord, 5 years old, heavily dented on the rear bumper. It parked near my woodpile and a man stepped out. He looked to be in his early 40s, wearing a faded polo shirt and jeans. He looked exhausted. He didn't march across my lawn. He walked carefully up the dirt path and stopped at the bottom of my newly framed steps. "Hi," he said, holding up a hand in a gesture of peace. "I'm Mitchell. I live on Elmwood Drive, about 3 streets over." "I know where Elmwood is," I said, leaning on my hammer. "What can I do for you, Mitchell?" He took a deep breath, looking around the property. He noticed the new lumber, the cleared brush, the lack of a junk truck. I had parked it around back. "I was at the meeting. I saw what you did." "Then you know I'm busy." "Listen, man, you have to understand something," Mitchell said, his voice tight with stress. "Most of us hate Margaret. We really do. She treats the neighborhood like her personal kingdom. But nobody ever runs against her because nobody wants to deal with the drama. We just pay the fines to make her go away." "That's a hell of a defense," I replied coldly. "You funded a bully because you were too lazy to stop her, and she used your money to try and steal my grandfather's land. So excuse me if I don't feel a lot of sympathy for your situation." Mitchell rubbed his face, looking older than his years. "I get it, I really do. If I were you, I'd want to burn the whole place down too. But my wife is pregnant with our 3rd kid. We bought our house at the top of the market. If our HOA dues go up $1,000 a month, we lose our home. We go bankrupt, half the neighborhood will." He looked up at me, his eyes pleading. "Your grandfather was a legend around here for the older folks. Everyone knew Harrison was harmless. He was a good guy. Would he want 50 families put out on the street?" I stared at Mitchell. The wind rustled through the oak tree behind him. He was using Harrison against me, but the frustrating part was he was right. Harrison wouldn't have pulled the trigger. Harrison would have forgiven them. But I wasn't Harrison. "I'm not going to evict families, Mitchell," I said slowly. The relief that washed over his face was immediate. His shoulders dropped an inch. "But," I continued, holding up a finger, "I am not letting the people who tortured an old man stay in power. I will cancel the reassessment. I will lock the lease rate in for another 10 years at the current price. But I have conditions." Mitchell nodded eagerly. "Anything, name it." "First, the HOA dissolves its Architectural Control Committee immediately. Second, you hold an emergency recall election by Friday. Margaret, Chad, and Richard are gone, barred from holding any board position ever again. Third, the new board publicly drops all claims, liens, and fines against this property, with prejudice." I stepped down the unfinished stairs, standing eye to eye with him. "And finally, Margaret comes here to this porch, and she apologizes, to my face, for what she did to my grandfather." Mitchell swallowed hard. She'll never do it. Her pride won't let her. Then I guess you all better start packing, I said, turning my back on him and picking up my hammer. You have until Friday, Mitchell. Tell your neighbors to stop looking the other way. Word traveled fast when mortgages were on the line. By Wednesday evening, Oakmont Estates was a war zone. I could hear the shouting from my back porch. It sounded like a riot at a country club. According to Arthur, who was getting play-by-play updates from a panicked title agent in town, Mitchell had organized a block party that quickly turned into a tribunal. The silent majority had finally found their voice, and they were screaming for Margaret's head. But Margaret was not the kind of woman who surrendered gracefully. She was the kind of woman who doubled down until the bitter end. Convinced that the rules she weaponized against others would somehow protect her, Thursday morning brought a new visitor. A white county fleet vehicle rumbled down the driveway. A tired-looking man with a clipboard and a faded yellow safety vest climbed out. He introduced himself as Wayne, the regional code enforcement inspector. He got an anonymous tip, Wayne sighed, looking at my half-finished porch and the stacks of lumber. Caller claimed there was unpermitted structural demolition, raw sewage dumping, and illegal commercial logging happening on this parcel. Stated it was an immediate public health hazard. I almost laughed. Commercial logging? Does it look like a wire user camp out here, Wayne? Wayne scratched his neck. Looks like a guy fixing up his granddad's cabin. But I gotta do the inspection, son. Protocol. I walked Wayne around the property. I showed him the building permits Arthur had filed for me the week before. I showed him the intact septic field. I even showed him the pile of dead oak branches I'd chopped for firewood, which Margaret had apparently classified as commercial logging. Wayne took some notes, shook his head in disgust, and signed off on the inspection right there on the hood of my truck. Sorry to waste your time, Wayne muttered, handing me the yellow carbon copy. Some folks just got nothing better to do than use the county as their personal attack dogs. Watch your back with these HOA types. They get mean when they lose. I pinned the clean inspection report to the front door of the cabin. A little trophy for the collection. It didn't take long for the final confrontation to materialize. Friday afternoon, the sky was a bruised, heavy purple, threatening a summer thunderstorm. I was sitting on a camp chair on the new porch, drinking a glass of ice water, waiting. I knew she would come. She had no other options left. The recall election was scheduled for 6 o'clock that evening. Mitchell had already texted me. We have the votes. It's a landslide. She knows. At 4:30, the silver Lexus appeared. It didn't creep down the driveway this time. It flew, hitting the ruts so hard the suspension bottomed out with a sickening metallic crunch. The car slammed into park on the dirt, and Margaret threw the door open. She looked entirely unraveled. The rigid blonde helmet of hair was flat and flyaway on one side. Her makeup was smudged, giving her the appearance of a very angry raccoon. She wasn't carrying her white binder. She was carrying a thin leather folio. She marched up to the steps, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. She stopped at the bottom. Looking up at me, I didn't stand up. I just took a sip of my water. "You think you're so clever," she hissed, her voice shaking with rage. "You think you can just waltz in here and destroy my community." "It's my land, Margaret," I said softly. "You just live on it." "I built this neighborhood," she screamed, pointing a finger at my chest. "I maintained the property values. I kept the trash out. I made Oakmont what it is, and you are ruining it over some misguided sense of revenge for an old man who didn't even belong here." The absolute lack of remorse was staggering. Even now, facing the loss of her power and her home, she couldn't see Harrison as a human being. He was just a variable she hadn't been able to control. "Did you bring the apology, Margaret?" I asked, setting my glass down. She flinched. Her eyes darted around the yard, looking anywhere but at me. She opened the leather folio and pulled out a single sheet of paper. Her hands were trembling so badly the paper rattled. "The board," she choked out, her voice barely a whisper. She cleared her throat and tried again, forcing the words through gritted teeth. "The board has drafted a resolution to drop all pending fines and liens against this parcel." She shoved the paper toward me. I didn't take it. "That's the paperwork," I said, my voice dropping to a dead, flat calm. "I asked for an apology, to my face, for what you did to Harrison." Margaret stood frozen. The wind picked up, kicking red dust around her expensive shoes. her face twisted into a mask of pure, ugly pride. "I have nothing to apologize for," she spat. "I enforced the rules when he was in violation. I did my job." I stared at her for a long, heavy moment. I saw exactly what she was. She wasn't a monster. She was just small. A small, bitter person who needed to control others to feel significant. Without her title, without her clipboard, she was nothing but a frightened woman standing on a dirt road. "Keep the paper," I said quietly. Her brow furrowed in confusion. "What?" I said, "Keep it. I don't need it." I stood up, stretching my back. "The recall vote is in an hour. Mitchell is going to win. The new board will drop the liens legally, and they'll sign the 10-year lease extension. I don't need anything from you anymore." "But the apology, you said—" "I wanted to see if you were capable of it," I interrupted. "I wanted to see if there was a single shred of human decency left in you. There isn't, so we're done here." I turned and walked toward the front door. "You can't do this," she shrieked behind me. "I am the president of Oakmont Estates." I paused with my hand on the doorknob, looking back over my shoulder. The first heavy drop of rain hit the tin roof. "Not anymore, Margaret. Now get off my property before I have your car towed." Friday night's storm finally broke around 2 in the morning, leaving behind a heavy, dripping silence. The kind of quiet that settles deep into your bones. I sat by the wood stove until dawn, watching the embers burn down to ash, listening to the water roll off the tin roof. The anger that had been driving me all week, the sharp, cynical adrenaline that pushed me to corner Margaret and break Chad, was gone. In its place, I just felt a profound, hollow exhaustion. By 10 o'clock Saturday morning, the sun was burning the last of the fog out of the pine canopy. That was when Mitchell's dented Honda rolled back down the driveway. He didn't look like a man who had just won an election. He looked like a guy who had survived a 10-car pileup. He parked near the woodpile, cut the engine, and stepped out. He was holding a large manila envelope and 2 cardboard cups of coffee from the gas station, out on the highway. I walked down the new porch steps and met him halfway. "Black," he said, handing me one of the cups. "Figured you weren't the type for vanilla syrup." "Appreciate it." I took a sip. It was burnt and entirely too hot. It was perfect. Mitchell let out a long breath, looking around the property. He seemed to finally notice the quiet. No lawnmowers, no leaf blowers, just the wind in the oak leaves. "It's nice out here. I get why he didn't want to leave." "What happened at the clubhouse, Mitchell?" He handed me the thick envelope. "Bloodbath. I've never seen 80 senior citizens turn into a mob so fast. Margaret tried to gavel them down. She tried to claim the land lease was a forgery, that you were running a scam. It didn't work. The title agent I called brought the county records to the meeting." Mitchell scratched the back of his neck, staring at his boots. When she realized she had lost the room, she just broke. She started yelling at people, telling them they were ungrateful, telling them they wouldn't survive a month without her keeping the property values up. It was actually kind of sad toward the end. Chad sneaked out the back door halfway through her meltdown. I opened the envelope. Inside was a stack of legal documents. The first was a certified resolution from the newly formed Oakmont Estates Board of Directors, signed by Mitchell as the acting president. It officially dissolved the Architectural Control Committee and vacated every single fine, lien, and complaint ever levied against Harrison's parcel, retroactively to the date of their inception. The second document was the ground lease extension, 10 more years, $12,000 annually, signed and notarized. "You kept your word," I said, sliding the papers back into the envelope. "We didn't have a choice," Mitchell replied, offering a tired smile. "But for what it's worth, I'm sorry. We should have paid attention. We let her turn this place into a dictatorship because it was easier than fighting her. That's on us. It won't happen again." We shook hands, a firm, simple agreement between two guys who just wanted to be left alone in their respective homes. Mitchell got back in his Honda and drove away. We back to the manicured lawns and the white vinyl fences. Things moved quickly after that. 3 days later, Arthur Pendleton called to confirm the liens were officially wiped from the county registry. The title to the cabin was free and clear, Arthur charged me exactly $1 for his services, claiming the entertainment value of watching Miller and Associates panic was payment enough. Margaret didn't stick around to endure the consequences of her reign. The following Monday, a real estate sign went up on her immaculate front lawn. She had listed the house slightly below market value, desperate for a quick sale. She couldn't handle being a regular resident. Her entire identity was tied to the clipboard, the white binder, and the power to tell other people how to live. Without the authority to measure grass height and dictate paint colors, Oakmont Estates was just a subdivision to her. I was on the roof, patching shingles when the moving truck arrived at her place. I paused, wiping sweat from my forehead, and watched through the gap in the trees as men loaded her pristine white furniture into the back of a van. She stood in the driveway wearing her tennis visor, barking orders at the movers. Even in defeat, she couldn't stop managing people. I just shook my head, picked up my hammer, and went back to work. Over the next few months, the cabin slowly came back to life. I didn't modernize it. I didn't put up drywall or install smart thermostats. I just fixed what was broken. I replaced the rotted floorboards, scrubbed the moss off the north-facing logs, and rebuilt the stone chimney so the wood stove drafted properly. The physical labor was a grind, but it was exactly what I needed. Every rusted nail I pulled, every board I cut, felt like a conversation with Harrison. A way to apologize for not being there when he was fighting those battles alone. By late October, the air turned crisp. The leaves on the massive oak tree by the porch shifted into deep shades of bronze and crimson. I was sitting on the top step, nursing a mug of coffee, watching a pair of deer pick their way through the brush near the property line. I reached into my flannel pocket and pulled out Harrison's old cherrywood pipe. I hadn't packed it with tobacco. I just held it, turning the smooth, worn wood over in my fingers. Beyond the trees, I could faintly hear the distant sound of a car driving through Oakmont Estates. A quiet, harmless hum. Nobody was coming down my driveway. Nobody was bringing a clipboard. The property line was finally just a line in the dirt, exactly as it should be. I leaned back against the cedar post, took a deep breath of the cold mountain air, and finally felt at home. Sometimes the best way to handle a neighborhood tyrant isn't by screaming back. It's by quietly holding all the cards and letting them play themselves into a corner. Harrison's legacy wasn't just this cabin. It was the lesson that patience and a rock-solid deed beat a plastic clipboard every single time. If you loved watching Margaret's HOA empire crumble to the ground, smash that like button and share this video with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe for more crazy, deeply human revenge stories and drop a comment below. How would you have handled Margaret? Catch you in the next one.